Transform Drug Policy Foundation's job is to protect people. And what Prohibition has miserably failed to do over the last 100 years or so is protect anybody. It's failed to protect users, of whom there are 240 million globally. People who use and people who misuse drugs, neither of whom are protected by being criminalised. But then if you go up through the supply chain, so suppliers who are unregulated dealers and criminals have been gifted the trade by Prohibition in the same way that alcohol Prohibition did between 1920 and 1932 in the US. And then if you go all the way through to production, you have entire countries whose economies are distorted, where corrupt cartels and drug lords, drug gangs distort the security, the development, the economy, and the whole politics of entire regions of the world, from Afghanistan to Colombia. So that's why Prohibition doesn't work, why we oppose it, and why we want to put in place a system of legal control and regulation. Legal regulation is vastly better than Prohibition. It's what we call the least worst solution. We can't stop people taking drugs. In a fantasy world, people wouldn't take drugs, people wouldn't supply them, people wouldn't produce them. And everybody could live healthy lives where they play basketball instead. But realistically, people will continue to use drugs and people will continue to misuse drugs. I mean, neither of those groups are protected through Prohibition, but they are much, much better protected through legal regulation. So if you look at the way that Prohibition makes drugs more dangerous, it makes them dirty, it makes them expensive. So legal regulation controls price, it controls the availability. You can put age controls on there, so that keeps consumers safer. But then when you go up the supply chain, you put doctors and pharmacists in control of who dispenses, prescribes, or licensed retailers in terms of who sells drugs. Well, there's a bit of a myth around where Prohibition came from, and a lot of people who are in support of it will tell you that it's there to protect people, to keep them safe, to stop people using, to stop people supplying, to stop people producing, but it never did that. And actually it was never intended to. If you look at the origins throughout the mid-20th century of the contemporary Prohibition, the Prohibition that manifested in the United Nations conventions where it's held, the forces that pushed that were primarily political forces in the United States, and they primarily were based on xenophobia. That is the fear and hatred of foreigners. And I know that sounds strong, when you're thinking about Prohibition set up to A, to stop people taking drugs, and B, to prevent harm. It was never intended to do that. It basically identified Chinese people, Afro-Americans and Hispanics through the criminalisation of opium, cannabis and cocaine as a threat to the US labour market, and scapegoated groups that were identified. You couldn't criminalise those people, but you could criminalise their cultures, and part of their culture was related to their drug use. So Prohibition is coming to almost a natural end, in the same way that alcohol Prohibition did. It had so many negative consequences that by 1932 people were ready to stick it back in the bin where it came from. It had created the US mafia. And in a sense, that's what we've done with the global Prohibition. It's created an international mafia, or enriched the international mafia to an extent where they are incredibly powerful, and people recognise that. It's the second largest money earner for organised crime. Secondly, there's a popular will against it now. People see legalisation of cannabis happening around the world now and recognise that they can not only keep their youngsters safer as a result of age controls, they can keep the mafia out of the business. Thirdly, the removal of Prohibition enables governments to take back control of the trade from organised criminals who are actually competing with them for power. And those three things are bringing prohibition down. And as the legalisation moves forward, there will be a domino effect, and it will move quicker and quicker and quicker. We could see it gone in 10 years. The fact is that prohibition is not going to fall on its own. It was put in place primarily through liberal democracies. It wasn't voted for, but it was legislators who brought it in. MPs, congresspeople, elected officials all over the world who enacted this stupid piece of legislation which has caused a catastrophe for ordinary people all over the world. And it is ordinary people who can bring it down. But in order to do that, you have to go and hassle elected officials. So that the first thing that people have to do, if they think that this is the way forward, and if they're not convinced yet, then come visit our website. Just look up Transform Drugs or Anyone's Child, and find out more about what we do. You'll eventually be convinced. But when you are, you have to contact your MP. Go and see them and tell them that you want this ended and you want it replaced with a system that put doctors and pharmacists and licensed retailers in charge, not gangsters and unregulated dealers, because we want to keep our kids safe and we want to keep crime out of this business. It's not for them. It's for governments to take control of. But you have to go and see your elected official. So find out more about what we do, go and see them, get some advice from us, change the law, and we can end this prohibition sooner rather than later.